Hello to everyone who is listening this evening. I've just had a look at some of the comments in the chat and some of the names that have tuned in, and I recognise a number of you from back in the Edge days, which was our indoor gym in Sheffield. I can see Ben Heaston is on there as well, so Matt's brothers online, supporting the family. So I'm sure many of you will know myself and Graham fairly well from the kind of Sheffield Peak District climbing scene, but also a number of you will not be aware of who Graham is in particular. So I'm going to do a little intro to Graham to get us sort of kicked off for this combination of slideshow / interview on Graham, and then we'll kind of move into the full presentation. I've got a load of slides to show, things like that, and some stories to tell with Graham. So first off is to say that the backdrop to doing this presentation is that Graham has just released the Peak District Gritstone Guide, which is an amazing new guide that he is the author of. I've been reading it this week, and it's absolutely brilliant, really, really cool, and also kind of goes on from a career of Graham being a big contributor to the local Gritstone climbing scene, and an author of a number of articles and books as well. He's been climbing for almost 50 years on grit in the local scene, which that means that he's got a very, very big knowledge on the area. And aside from knowing a lot about all these routes, he's had his fair share of epics and involvement with minor rural local controversies. So we might delve into a few of those this evening. He was 20 years on the BMC Guidebook committee. He's on-sighted all the way up to E6. I think some of those were solo as well, and almost certainly before the era of pads where things don't always quite appear E6 once you shove 10 pads beneath you. So proper hardcore gritstoner, and in good style as well. And then also author of Peak Rock, which is like this just huge Bible of a book all about the history of the local area. And if anyone hasn't seen that, you really should just get a copy of it. It's like a lifetime ownership item. It's just like brilliant, really, really amazing bit of work. So welcome, Graham. And before I get into your presentation, do you mind if I tell a quick story to everyone about you?
No, that's fine.
Sure.
I'm worried now, but
yeah, again, what on earth are you going to go into this? So, as I said, many people here will know Graham, but for those who don't know Graham, I want to just tell a quick story about what kind of Graham for me symbolizes in someone who is a proper all-in lifer on rock and gritstone and has the kind of real energy and spirit of trad climbing and adventure. And this comes from the context that I met Graham at the local indoor climbing gym, and I'd the evening and he'd come out with, you know, all these tales about gritstone routes that he'd done back in his era, and he'd always be telling me that I wasn't doing things in, you know, quite the right style, and he'd always done it a bit harder than I, etc., etc. And eventually I finally got to this chance where I wanted to actually go climbing with him, and we were going to try this really obscure route on a gritstone buttress out in the Peak District, a gun buttress. No one ever goes there, I don't think. And it was this E4, and we thought it was maybe an unrepeated route, but I was dragged in because I was really into crack climbing, and Graham is ever interested in knowing about how hard some of these unrepeated routes were, no doubt doing a bit of research for his book as well. And I knew a bit about Graham, but not loads. And so we went to the crag, started to climb together, and, you know, roped up. I think I had a go on the route and possibly fell off. It was kind of a bit harder than I was expecting, kind of a bit tricky. And then Graham tied into the end of his rope. And Graham, to me, at that point, was like a 50-year-old plus guy down the local wall, giving me lots of stories of the past. And I kind of put him in this certain box and bracket of climber. But when he got on the end of the rope, it was literally like he'd wiped 30 years off his age, and he was like this 20-year-old kid starting around on the end of this rope and threw himself into this crux, just totally committed, not bothered at all about this fall. Took this great big fall, like swung in against the base of the route, almost hit the ground. And I just remember thinking, this is just incredible. This guy's got such a kind of energy for this kind of stuff. And as I've got to know Graham over the years, that really is who Graham is, as a climber, but also as an author. So I think this kind of sets us up into finding out a little bit more about the history and where you all came from, Graham, and how this all started. So let's get to the slides and let's see where it all started. So let me share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. And what we've got on screen in front of you is the Corkstone Stanton Moor 1970. Is this where it started, Graham?
Yeah, that's a nice introduction, Tom, until the bit where you said I fell off. I was quite enjoying it till then. It sounded quite good. Yeah, this is my first route I ever did, actually. I'm about 12 years old, and as you can see, it's got chipped footholds and stuck on a handhold. So it's very much of a modern idiom, really. It could be sort of one of the quarried routes, really. And I did do some research and found out that it was done in 1879 by a guy called Gary Gibson. Apparently, it's one of his first routes. But that was when I was a walker, really, and I got into climbing really by reading books, and I read about the South Face Annapurna and Willen's biography. And Mark Scott, who's here listening, we went and got my mother's washing line. It was one of those stories again. And we went to a local sandstone quarry, and it was clearly useless. This line, it just stretched and was very painful. And so we went and joined a local dysfunctional climbing club, and got taken around climbing, and saved up, and we bought a rope, and we went and bought a book, which was the Bible of the time. This was Blackshaw's book, which was something everybody used. And we got this rope. We went out climbing. This is in my guidebook. I talk about love at first sight, and this is me on my second ever day's climbing over at Gardens on a route called Flake Crack. Those days we didn't have harnesses, and we just had plimmers and the direct tine on the rope. And if anybody's never climbed like that, it's extremely painful if you get a tight rope or fall off. And even worse, if you're actually left hanging free, you can actually asphyxiate if you don't get lowered off. So it was quite an interesting time climbing with ropes like that. Anyway, as I said, Mark and I got this book called Blackshaw's, which was supposed to be the sort of state-of-the-art thing about how to learn to climb. We bought a rope and we started practicing with it in my mother's living room. And so he would lead from the dining room, I think, or living room to the dining room, and belay on a chair, tie in using the appropriate stuff. And then I'd lead through to the kitchen and out to the garden. We'd belay and practicing that until we went out. So I think we've got that, Tom, have we?
Yeah, I'm just I'm just trying to scroll through the screens. It's kind of interesting, the screen share.
Oh, there we are. Yeah, so that's the book we use. You can see it's extremely up to date, and in it has a line of holds that you could use. And oh, that's the nuts. Yeah, that was learning how to place nuts. They were getting quite advanced in those days, and it also showed us an interesting line of holds you could use. And if you look at the choice there, yeah, we've got the big jig on the left, but if you look on the right-hand side, that I think you'll find is a full crimp. So any wads out there are really thinking it's only just been devised. This is a book from about 1956 or something. And there it is, a full crimp. So nothing new, I'm afraid, in climbing.
Yeah, we all thought we had invented it.
So, yeah. So off we went with our newfound rope, and I think next slide shows Mark Scott, I think, leading away. And this is typical of the time. He's got a rope tie-in, but he's put a little bit of a leg loop on there to try and make it a bit safer, and he's got a runner in. If we look closely at that runner, you'll see he's weighted it nicely with, I think, 3 steel carabiners and what is a clog hexagon 7, I think. It rarely stayed in if you fell off anyway. That it used to pull and you'd end up on your backside if you actually fell off. But so these early days of climbing in the peak, Mark and I. And I think we moved on, got a bit more gear. So this is myself, 15 years old at Castle Naze, and basically, again, single tie-on and a sling carrying all the gear in one massive bunch. And for some reason, we seem to have a penchant for having long, dangly runners, and it just got in the way. It was just a complete mess, really. But and I'd saved and got some boots there, actual pair of EBs, and so it's looking up.
What sort of harness were you using at that time?
Not at all. It's just direct tie-on with the rope. So you just tie with a bowline around the waist, and like I say, it's extremely painful. If you fell off, there's a good chance you broke your rib, one or two ribs. And if you did hang off and didn't get lowered off to the ground, you could asphyxiate. It would stop your diaphragm from working. You'd die eventually if you were hanging free and couldn't get down onto the rock. So I used to practice ways of trying to prusik up the rope if that ever happened. But fortunately, harnesses came out and things got a little bit safer. And so this is the first extreme I ever did. Of course, the grades before E grades were hard, very severe, was followed by extremely severe. And this at the time was given extremely severe. It was a Joe Brown route. And I decided to top rope it. And Mark went to the top and he said he couldn't find a belay above the crux. So there I am, I'm just starting the crux. And so if I fell off that, I'd have probably been the first person to inspect downhill racer, I think, at the end of that. But I did it first go, and it made me really think about the style of climbing. So I suppose it was a head point when I soloed it about a year later. And I thought, well, actually, I don't want to top rope things. You can do them. It's much nicer when you don't top rope them. So really, after that, that was one of the last things I actually top roped, I think, on Grit for a very long while. And in fact, we thought on sighting meant you didn't use a guidebook. So we used to go along with the guidebook, but have it closed, and then we'd look at routes and climb them, and then we'd look to see what grade they were. We thought that's what on sight meant. So it was an odd time. We didn't talk a lot about climbing with people, and there wasn't a lot of media. There's no internet or anything, so you're very much in a vacuum a lot of the time when you're climbing.
And was this all pre-chalk as well?
Yeah, I think it looks really nice. If you look at the rock, some of these pictures you'll see, there's no chalk on them, and you forget actually what it was like to be climbing with no chalk. It was very, very different. If you go now down somewhere, I went to Lundy a while back after it opened at the start of the year, and there was no chalk. And I think it was an E3 up a face, and there was no chalk, and you couldn't see any runners, and it looked utterly desperate. It was blank, the face, and it really was a case of finding your way up, just hoping it would hold. It does make quite a difference. So if we go to the next slide. This is myself. I'm about 16 there, and the next, if you click again, we'll have the next one. I discovered that if you stopped to put runners in, it was really quite strenuous, and it sort of took time, and you got very tired. So I developed this technique of not actually putting runners in, even though I carried them up. And so both of those I've actually not got runner in yet, even on Goliaths. And that's the first time I did Goliaths. And I think it really, if anything, probably set my sort of not style of climbing, but maybe some of my strength in climbing, is that early period where I just did so much climbing without gear. And so I got into a position where I was fairly comfortable without gear, as long as I could climb technically okay and with enough stamina, I would be fairly happy and running it out quite a long ways on ground. So I think it was a sort of important time for me, that early time. Fortunately, I didn't fall off. So
so you never had any ground fall incidences, no near misses right at the start to kind of change your behaviours?
No, I did fail on a route, which made me think twice about rushing up the grades. So I was sort of rushing up the grades. I mean, we were doing hard BS at that time, within a year of, well within a year of started climbing. And that was a time when someone would come in the pub and a guy would say, "That's a VS man." And that was just somebody leading VS, and there would be, "That's a VS man." And I go, "Oh," like that. And so we were young lads leading sort of hard BS very early on. And then I think I was trying something, and I lost a bit of confidence, and I just came down and I thought, I need to start doing a lot more of these routes at the same grade. So then I really sort of consolidated things like VS and hard BS before I went on to extremes. So it was an important learning curve, I think, with that failure as well.
And was it, and can I also ask, at the same time, was that also a lot of the climbing very crack and corner based, so that the protection was the best and the kind of the lines were the most obvious?
Yes, I mean, there were a few well-known face ones, like the slabs, like Three Pebble slab and things like that. Three Pebble had no gear at all. I mean, now you can get a perfect wire and a perfect cam in. It's drilled. There's a self-drilled cam placement now where you can actually see the upper grooves and the lower grooves, which are out of line. And so it shows you which way to put the cam up, even in Three Pebble slab. But there was never any gear in it when we did it. Absolutely none. So there's some protected ones we do, but a lot of them are crack lines. Training, this is me doing some chimneying at my mother's, and you can see a couple of micro edges there, I think, Tom, if you look closely at those fingers. And so I used to climb up my chimney to the roof and then climb back down again. Mother, now this picture I was taken off a shed roof by Mark Scott. So I'm about sort of just near the top of the kitchen window there. And I used to do this for training. And then my mother was a bit frightened about this. And so one time I came back from school and she'd had some workmen come in and they completely rendered it with concrete, completely covered it up. So that was the end of that training. But,
And did you consider this sort of like all the sort of brick edge climbing and things like that in the more urban setting? Was this in your mind what was effectively training and preparation for the crags, or was it just a different form of climbing, like another way of messing around?
It was partly training and partly climbing when you couldn't get out into the peak. And we used to go on railway bridges, both in Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire, and top rope things. So we had things like Sam O'Taff Corner, because Sam climbed it first, and Lancashire Gates, because Howard Lancashire did it first. So we used to name them as well. There was one fantastic lay-by crack on a bridge in Nottingham city centre in a woman's garden. And we persuaded her to let us go and top rope this by telling her we were training for Everest. She was really impressed. And she said, "You must tell us if you get up Everest. You must." Oh, yes, we will. So it was a bit of fun, really. But it did work. I got strong fingers and things from that.
Yeah.
I used to hang on my mum's lintel, and that was about an 8mm lintel. So
I'm sure we've argued about this previously, Graham, and I said your mind was taking it.
Well, okay, it could be 9mm. Okay. So this is sort of moving on up the grades a bit, really. This is I've called it the Great Crack, and people might think that's odd because it's right to limit it. Well, one of the things I've done in the guidebook is I've renamed routes into their original names, because Joe Brown called this the Great Crack. It was called the Limits by a guidebook writer before they were ever climbed. And Joe did this, he called it the Great Crack. And he was quite upset, and even not long before he died, he again referred to it as the Great Crack and wondered why it hadn't been named correctly, because that's what he called it. So I think in sort of deference to the man and his passing, I thought it was important that we went back to his name. So he's called the Great Crack. And when I did it then, you can see I'm fully prepared. I'm in shorts with lovely patterned socks, and I've got my biggest nut there hanging off my harness, which is a hexagon 7. Full enough it never went in. But there were in those days 2 chock stones in the route, which I believe, I'm not sure there are many as that now. Are there one left or none?
I think there's one very low down right where it doesn't really do anything. So yeah, it's very chock stone free now.
Yes.
And has certainly changed in the last 10 years a little bit.
Yeah. And where do you stand on chock stones, Tom?
Oh, if I'm well, this comes into, see, I actually thought that you were involved in the Great Crack or the right eliminate controversy, because about 10 years ago or so, I think I saw a thread on UK Climbing talking about the chock stone in the route, and debating whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing. And for some reason, I don't know what it was, I just decided that it was just best if I just went out there and just took it out. So I went to the crag and took the chock stone out, and then found the fun in watching the online forums ignite after this moment, and everyone get very stewed up, and everyone asking about who on earth had gone and done it. And then within a week, the chock stone had been replaced again. So I went out again the next week and took that one out as well. And then people just gave up with it after that. And it climbs so much better without it. I actually think that chock stones really change and affect the style to the detriment of the route. They don't make very good moves. They make dubious protection where you might as well either push on or nowadays place a big friend. So I'm not a big fan, actually.
I think lattice trading should bring out a bag very much like a bowling ball bag that you can put on your harness and have a big chock stone that you can carry up and then put it in, and your second comes up and takes it out. I think that's the way ahead if you can't afford a giant cam.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is also the argument that the Czech climbers also say that any crack where you can get anywhere up to kind of half a hip in, they just call that a belay. So it's just a, you know, a belay all the way up, so you can't possibly complain about it.
I mean, that's funny because in the 20s they used to belay in off-widths. There are 2 routes on Stanage where they took a belay part by wedging themselves into an off-width. They didn't tie on; they just wedged themselves in and brought the partner up and then carried on. So yeah.
And just out of curiosity as well, is what are the other routes that you've renamed aside from Right Limnut to Great Crack?
There's Cave Buttress on Stanage. That was originally called Berg's Buttress by Kelly, who did the route, and because of Ivor Berg's fantastic routes that he did, it was sort of in memoriam to him. So I put that name back in, so it's now named after Berg for his visit here. There's a couple of others. Norse route is actually the proper name of Norse Corner Climb, for example. And there's a couple on the Roaches as well that have had their names put back to the originals. There's I think it's Manchester. There's one of the routes on Stanage, which might be on near Manchester Buttress, which is actually its proper name is Angle Crack. How they call it. One of the problems was some of the guidebook writers didn't use the journals when they put together the guides, and also in the journals, if you didn't know Stanage really well, they were putting routes in which were like 200 yards apart, so it was difficult to find them unless you knew the features really well. And if you go back now and look at the journals, you can recognize exactly where they meant. And so
yeah. So moving one edge over.
Yes.
Over to Froggatt. Tell me a little bit about Long John Slab and how was that in 1976?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I had a sort of time on Froggatt where I used to go and love going around doing the slabs and things, and had a day one day where I had one of these Eye of the Tiger days. So I've always loved Froggatt. I went along one day doing just all of them: Long Johns, downhill, hairless, heartless, hairy, artless, the whole lot, one after the other. It's just wonderful. So I've always had a love affair with the slabs on Froggatt. And this is one of the earliest ones that I did that was particularly difficult, I think. So
okay, yeah. And
the flares on, and flares are always good for climbing because they often cover up your feet. So you've got to know where the foothold is before you do the move, rather than just look for it. So it's good for footwork.
It's funny when I look at this photo of Long John's, this looks a lot more committing to how, like, the boulders on the crag moved or something, because this looks much harder and more committing than when I did it.
I don't know. Yeah, it's there's still that nasty one at the bottom that you can land on.
Yeah. And do you think these slabs in particular have changed a lot over the last sort of 40 or 50 years? Do you think the nature of them is quite different now because we've obviously had thousands of ascents of these routes now?
They've definitely got more worn. The holes have got more worn, and you find they're not a square cut edge, because Froggatt, whatever people think about it, is actually a quarried crag. It's not a natural edge. It's just a quarried edge that's weathered into a more natural. The features gone more natural, but so it's not quite as sharp edged as Millstone is. But because of the climbing, what originally sharp edged on these routes have now rounded off considerably, and that's shown quite a lot of gritstone routes that started off with sharp edges. They've now actually got rounded holes, and they're going up in grade bit by bit. Quite a few of them.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of grade creep up and down, and that's the nature of sandstone gritstone climbing.
I think one interesting thing about grade creep is that people have got used to having more and more protection, and when these routes were originally done, I'm not talking about Long Johns, but some of the VS cracks, for example, they were given very severe with no runners because there weren't any nuts about, and yet now they get very severe and you can ram them full of gear. So the grade hasn't gone down. Like Elter Crack on Rivlin was very severe as a solo. It's now very severe with lots of gear. So there's an interesting thing about the way gears change people's attitude to things. And I think people expect so much gear now, and they're really surprised if a route doesn't have gear. They think it should have a really high grade.
And do you feel a lot of responsibility as a guardian of the guidebook writer to actually move these grades, left and right or up and down, because ultimately someone has to form this consensus at the end and kind of put a stamp on it. And both you and I know that guidebooks and online guides are often the reference point, even if the pub disagrees.
Yeah, I think I tried. I mean, when I first started, I was so much into gritstone. I think I was probably at the wrong end of the scale to an extent. And I found the first guide I ever worked on, which I started in '79, and it came out. I don't know if you can see that. That's the Stanage Millstone Guide of 1983. And I wrote the north section up to High Neb, Stanage. And I found this again today, and I've just read what it says in the inside cover. This was given to me by the series editor. It says, "If the grades are all wrong, we know where to find you." And I do admit, I'd originally got Goosey Gandering as E36A and things like that, because I thought, well, it's 6A with a overhead runner and it's only a couple of moves, so how can it be any harder than E3? I think it gets E5 now. But I've mellowed, and for this guidebook, climbing both on the eastern side and moorland and western side, all within a period of 1,300 routes. Within the period I was climbing, checking closely all across the peak, and I sort of rationalized the grades to like a Stanage level. So I've tried in the guidebook to have all the grades, if you like, to Stanage standard, and so quite a few of the moorland grades have gone up because of that. So the severes have gone to VS and things like that, and hard VS has gone up to E1, because they always used to be pretty hard on the moorland areas. And I thought, no, let's rationalize it and let's try and get it. And I've also tried to do grades for morphology. So, I'm fed up with grades, which certain particular routes, which are really hard if you're short, and it's never really been recognised. So in some of these routes, I've actually given 2 grades, or I've given a grade for if you're less than average, because not everybody's a man than 5'10", and that seems to be what the grades are averaged for. So I've had to correct that as well in the guide. So you'll see certain routes have got multiple grades on them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's like even this, this route here, which is, another Froggatt route, but quite a tricky E5. And I think the crux move here, where you reach out to that flake on strapodictomy and go out onto that that hard move. It's totally reach dependent, really,
yeah, it is.
If you think about it. And I mean, was that one of your earliest E5s, or?
Yeah, I think by 81 I was getting into repeating the grit stuff, because as I sort of alluded to before, I wasn't really interested in practicing things and top roping things. I was much more interested in trying to do things on site, and I got a lot more out of doing a lot of John Allen's routes, for example, on site 4 or 5 years after he did them, and really enjoyed it. And strapodictomy was one of the first ones I think I got. After that, I sort of carried on really just working around the Peak District, doing some of the harder routes. And you were saying about the time, it was quite a different time, because I would often be solo doing this. I wouldn't be with people. There were no mobile phones around. There were no mats. And you go out and do them. And it was very much sort of very committing thing as well, quite a personal thing, quite different, I think, sometimes to what experiences can be like today.
Yeah. And with this route as well as that, I mean, I guess I must have done it 5 or 6 times, and I think that the nature of gritstone almost at any particular grade is so dependent on moving well at that time, and something like this, that strapodictomy, an E5 classic at the grade, and is considered not super tough at the grade. If you're climbing well and you're really into your gritstone, it can feel very reasonable. But take someone who's barely climbed on gritstone but might be very capable physically, they'll have a really hard time with something like this, which is quite technical, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when I did it, I was with a couple of friends who were both quite comfortably 5 leaders on limestone, and for doing new routes of that grade on limestone, and they both couldn't touch it. They both fell off it repeatedly. So yeah, it's indicative of the sort of nature of the climbing on gritstone.
And where did you sort of your hardest routes get to on grit? What was the kind of the pinnacle of where you felt like you got to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 1 or 2 coming up in a bit. We'll see. They've got those. I'll show you. Yeah, we'll talk about those perhaps in a minute if we flash through the next.
Jumping ahead, I'll come back to those in a minute.
Yeah,
let's talk about this Stanage classic.
Yeah, I because I was really into on-sighting, I didn't really do a lot of first ascents. And I actually felt, I think I was rather isolated, my friend and I, and really a few of us climbed together, weren't really in the scene. And I didn't realise how much pre-practicing was going on for first ascents and things. I had this idea that you should really do everything on site, or at least try it on site. And so I remember top roping Ulysses in EBs, which had not been done very often, at least. And finding it, okay, sort of 4 times I top roped it, and I thought I could probably get this if I go again. But then thinking, actually, it's cheating. This, really, it's just a joke if I top rope it this many times to do it. And but anyway, I sort of saw this face, and I thought quite like the look of it, and this is one of the first ascents I'm quite pleased that I did. That's a guy called Giles Barker who started writing Peak Rock, who sadly died long before it could be finished. And the line there, that cleaning, is by John Allen, I found out. We turned up to look at this wall, and it had all these brand new marks on, and John had been looking at it, but he'd actually failed on it, and he sort of tried it a weird way, and he'd not thought of the way I did it. So you can see the move is a sort of interesting move off the middle of the undercut there.
And is this sort of like brushing marks, or is this chalk? And
I think that's brushing marks. That's before we went on it. That's when we arrived. So John had recently been cleaning it.
What was the attitude around brushing at the time? Because I know nowadays it's very, formulated that no one really in their right mind would touch a wire brush, or like aggressively brush stuff on the wrong type of gritstone or on really wet days. What was it like back then?
People use wire brushes.
They did.
Yeah, and some people were good at using them carefully, and some people weren't. Livesey, when he did down a racer, they joked that he used a wire brush made of 6-inch nails. It was so obviously chipped. But yeah, there was a bit of that went on, a bit of leaning in on the brush, definitely.
And how did the climbing community deal with that at the time? Because nowadays it's, a lot of the communication that goes on in the climbing community is quite online, I think, as a whole. And it's easy to see the consensus of the whole area and what people think. But I'm assuming then it was more discussed in the pub at the Crag.
Yeah, and I think there was some letters to magazines occasionally about this going on. But as you say, the internet wasn't there. You couldn't have these huge arguments and forums online. You just learn about it. Or you go back to read and think, this has changed a bit. Has somebody been playing with it? But so it's a bit more under the radar, I think, going on then.
Yeah. I incidentally, I thought this route was really good. I went and repeated this one evening after work, after you'd been going on about it for about the 100th time and how brilliant it was. So I eventually had to go out and do it.
Yeah, it's nice route. If you look at my head, I've got a bandage on there. I look like a prop forward who's just been put back on the pitch. That's because I climbed up, put some RPs in, and climbed back down and pulled on them, and they just came out and split my head open.
Oh, really?
Giles had a massive casualty type bag, with a casualty tent and everything, just a huge medical kit, and he just I've got everything for that, and he just wrapped this massive bandage around my head and carried on. But I've realised looking at these that you look at the next one as well. I think that's sort of the crux, and then that's this just above it. There's a lovely hand placed peg goes down into a pocket, but I realised there actually I'm not leading it, I'm soloing it, because you can see from the ropes they're not going anywhere into a plate. There's Giles took those pictures. So I'm doing it again for pictures straight after I read it. It just occurred to me.
Could you use a nut key in this same sort of situation? Just shove a nut in?
I have done that as well in the past, yeah. In fact, there's a route on Stan, it's quite a relatively modern one, which is a direct start to Good Clean Fun up on the northern end, which uses you can put a nut key in. It's like a really hard direct start to an E4. You slot it in beautifully. So,
I think that's something that you don't see the kids doing so much anymore. Sticking random bits of metal into
no.
Because there was a real attitude around sort of using homemade items, and I feel like that was like a hangover from the era of getting like nuts and bolts and essentially slinging those and using those in the Crag as well.
Yeah, the routes on the Grocken and on Grove Garth, which had bicycle parts in and just any bits of metal they could find to hammer in. So yes, but they were for aided, of course, at one time. But, it's funny. The reason I put this in, it's quite a funny story of going around doing moonwalk. Moonwalk, the picture, I think if you look at the next picture of me, I'm on the sort of crux bit, and that's sort of important. I'm giving away a bit of beta there if no one's seen this, but I've done it, but there we are. And it was in the Derwent Valley guide, and I was walking along one day and a guy was repeatedly falling off on this section, and he was just wrong-handed, and I watched him for a bit, and he was sat on the ground looking a bit fed up, and I said, You perhaps really need to cross your hands on this, and he goes, no, the guy in the guidebook's not doing it like that. And I said, well, that's me. He wouldn't have it. So I just wandered off and left him.
Really?
So that's why that's in. Just a bit of fun. Okay.
And what about Masters? What about Millstone? How much time did you spend there?
I brought this in really because it's about dreams, and you really never know what you might achieve when you're young. And if you click again, you'll see this red circle appears, and the left-hand person there is two people there. Left-hand one is me, and I'm watching Tom Proctor doing the first ascent of Great Arret, and just absolutely gobsmacked at it. I couldn't believe it. And then, and yet how things change. If you look at 10 years on, there's myself on exactly the same position there as Tom on sighting it. So you never really know what's coming on around the corner with climbing. I remember thinking I'd never do Great Wall on clogging, and then a few years later I was doing it. So it's just keep climbing and keep trying and enjoying it and things.
Yeah. And what we've got, this is a standard route here, isn't it? It's a wall of sound.
Yeah, I'm sort of moving on to the harder stuff really now, approaching sort of the limits of things I was doing, sort of on site or ground up, and that's Wall of Sound. Bit of controversy about it. That's one of John Allen's best lines, actually. It's a beautiful line that he did when he came back. But the runner slot was, well, didn't last for long. I was lucky, I fell off a couple of times and it held, but later on it pulled. And the reason being is it was created by a butter knife. And John had this very flat bladed butter knife, which would scrape very nicely into narrow seams and things. And after he'd scraped for a while, there was a runner slot. But unfortunately, when you break the pattern of a gritstone, of course, it becomes soft. And so the runner slot didn't last very long. So it's a bit harder. It's probably more, if you go direct, it's probably more easy to do that. So yeah, lovely shot by Ian Smith there. And then Cool Moon, just left of Moonwalk, of course. This is, I think, about the third ascent of that. With the cider and the down and right. We didn't have any small cams at the time, but and yeah, it's good fun, good climbing. That was for an advert shot, but they never used it. And the harness they gave me was actually too big. It was only just staying on me at the time. And the guy who was belaying was dragged out. He'd only climbed about once before. So it was all a bit of a hairy thing. But so this sort of limit I got to really climbing on Gritstone. It got to the point where for some of them, unless somebody cleaned them for you, you had to ab down and clean them. So I'd do sort of like what I call hands-off inspections, where I wouldn't take gear and I wouldn't feel the holes, but I'd have to clean them before I did them to try and get the on-site. And that was the sort of limit I reached really on ground up and on-site. And I did try some head pointing later on, which I sort of did some harder stuff, head pointing, a couple of E7s and things. But I sort of ultimately found them not as good because they just didn't seem so hard. I get them first go on a top rope or something or second go, and I think, oh, if I really was mentally strong enough, I'd on these. So I sort of did some for a bit and then just stopped doing it. Didn't enjoy it so much.
And what did you feel about, how does it fit with you, the routes which have got, the old bolt heads from, places like Millstone or, pegged out routes?
Yeah, I mean, we thought it was bomber, when you got in situ gear, we just thought it was amazing. We didn't really think about the fact that we're a 1/4 of an inch diameter and 1.5 centimeters or 2 centimeters in. They were just bomber in situ gear. And so that was just good fun. And the same on the limestone, when they started freeing stuff, you'd find something that had like 2 old pegs for the old piece of tat and an old bolt, and you go, oh, crikey, sport route. And you're going up it. In reality, it was really still probably E5 or E6. But yeah. You're so confident that this stuff would hold,
Did you fall off on this route?
No, I didn't know. No, I didn't touch the bolts at all. They're not there now, of course, but it's lovely climbing.
It's fantastic. It's now got a load of pegs in it.
Low pegs, yeah, a bit of a shame. It's many people do it now, I guess. But, right. Yeah, and that's about it. Oh, right. Okay, so this is the first, although I started working guidebooks in about 79, this was the 89 Standage guide. It's the first one I sort of had some overall control of as a whole guide. I remember at the time, the controversy, because the left-hand picture is a rear cover, not the front cover. And for, a long time, those are the sort of pictures that went on front covers, the classic sort of shot of a Harvey S or an E1, and I decided we're going to have something new. And this is, of course, Johnny doing Saddam's Friends First Ascent. And so we put that on. And I remember that being a great fun time working on that guide and trying trying to put that together.
Yeah.
And so that's just one of the sort of guides I've worked on over the past, 40 years of working on guides, really. And that gave me a grounding into sort of writing guides and working out what I wanted to put in them. And so when Vertebrate said to me, do I want to do a guidebook? I thought, well, after 40 years of working with other people's, I thought, yeah, I do actually, because I've done a lot of rewriting and correcting and changing. And I also thought it's time to put passion back into guidebooks. I wanted to put a guidebook out that people would read, because I used to read guidebooks when I was young, and I used to read them when I went to bed, and I used to read them in evenings and even at school. And I'd get really psyched by reading about the routes and the history and just some of the descriptions. And I thought that was starting to go from guidebooks, particularly in topo guides. And I just wanted something that was putting my passion for gritstone climbing and the uniqueness of gritstone climbing into descriptions and trying to enthuse people and inspire them by doing that. So this is why I took it on, really.
And I think, you know, from talking to you, is that the amount of research that you put into these guides, or this guide, is just immense. Like, you actually went out and climbed the vast majority of the routes. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I in the 3 years or so I was doing the close checking of a lot of routes, of course, I'd done before, and some I'd done so many times I didn't need to check, and others I'd not done for years, and others I'd not done at all. So in the sort of 3 years I was doing the work, I did 1,300 routes on Gritstone all over, and I always record routes anyway, but these are the diaries that I kept showing the checking for the grades and the routes I've done. So I think there's a few examples there of days out on there, and, you know, comments about routes and gear and etc. Because I used to go and shunt them or have them and take gear with me, because you if you're soloing or shunting, you need to check the gear placements out if you're going to describe the grade, or if there's some hidden gear or something that's crucial. So I wanted it to be as accurate as possible, not only just really enjoyable, but really accurate as well, you know, bang up to date with stuff. So yeah, lots and lots, 180 visits I did over the 3 years. I climbed over 1,300 routes during those 3 years to make sure I've got it sort of bang up to date. And hopefully that comes across as well from the descriptions and the lines and topos and things, that it is accurate.
I mean, we're definitely going to still disagree with a whole load of your grades. I mean, I've had a look through the guide, and some of those I just can't agree with, Graham.
Any ones in particular come to mind?
Well, one that comes into mind immediately was going out on my own the other day and going to Chatsworth and shunting Twisted Reach.
Oh yeah.
And I can't say I agree with your E4 grade on that.
Bomber runs next year. You bump gear in the brake. I mean, it's perfect. You can't go anywhere.
I think we must have been on a different route, you know.
Yeah, there's a bomber brake, isn't it? It's really good gear, and then but the problem is if you fall off, you end up on your wrist a bit, and that's the only problem. But anyway, we're wearing at the time. We're probably
yeah. Should we see if there's some questions and things like that?
Yeah, if we can. Not sure. Can we pop through? Just want to show a couple of example pages from the guide of what some things I was trying to do in the guide. If we zip through those. Yeah, I've tried to put a load of font grades in. So any routes that are highballable have a highballable section or a really hard start or something, then they've got font grades as well as E grades. So you've got the sort of split thing of headball grade, high point grade, or high point grade. Sorry, I'm getting wrong there, aren't I? High ball grade and or a normal trad grade. And also I've put a lot of French grades in as well, which I think really helps on some of the harder routes to get an idea what French grade they are. So something like London Wall, it comes out about, say, French 7A plus or something like that. So nearly a lot of the hard routes, or from E5 upwards, have got French grades as well. So I've tried to bring that in.
Yeah, well, that now gives you 3 possible sort of standpoints in which people can disagree with you in the grade as well, which I think it's a fantastic strategic move, that.
Yeah, and finally I've got also history stuff, and if you move on just a couple more,
yeah,
we've got that's with London Wall, with the description of London Wall there with the French grade there, and finally there's some of the history stuff. So you'll find peppered through the guide bits of information, and this is a party and shot bit describing what's been happening today on party and shot and where we've got to on it and who's done what and things. So hopefully people enjoy that as well.
Oh, amazing. Well, I'm sure many people will yeah, go and have a look at the guide. And I think it's published by Vertebrate, isn't it?
Yeah, Vertebrate Publishing. Yeah.
Yeah. And are they selling that just in shops or online as well?
They've got, you can buy it directly from them online. They've got 20, well, they do have 20% off. I think they still have at the moment with free postage backing, and it's in all the climbing shops and bookshops, local bookshops, and Amazon. All the online sellers have got it as well. And I've got some signed copies available in Haversidge at the moment as well. So.
Oh, brilliant! I had a look at my copy. Mine's signed as well, Graham.
Good.
I just noticed. I'm holding hold of that one.
Okay. So can we have the one last slide, because I think this is one of the best pictures ever taken on climbing on Gritstone.
Oh God, yeah. Is that you?
Yeah, that's the hauler, and that was taken at about 6:30 in the morning at -6 degrees when we started. And it's a lovely picture. And for me, just sort of, yeah, says it all about Gritstone. Amazing rock.
Well, thanks very much for that, Graham. That was really cool to chat to you about the, Gritstone, the guide, the route naming, everything. It's and I'm sure anyone who will, read the guide and see it as well will get your passion that comes across in all of this, because it is, it's really superb, the contribution that you've made to it over the years. I think it's really hard to overstate that. So yeah, really, really amazing.
I think there's a couple of questions. Yeah, how did it ever get called white eliminate? Eliminates our routes between the obvious lines. That's a good point, actually. Yeah, but I don't know if there's any more questions.
I've got a couple here.
Right.
A question: what are your favourite routes that you've done on Grit? And what route have you still haven't done, but you would like to do?
Favourite routes, gosh, there's so many hundreds. I think a lot of the Staffordshire ones, actually, funny enough, we tend to think of me climbing along Stanage, but Staffordshire Hen Cloud routes are just fantastic. I think they're underestimated. Things like Caricature are just brilliant route. It's a superb route. And I don't know. I mean, there are just so many. Things like the wonderful technicality of Prophet of Doom, and the sort of boldness of some of the slabs that you get on Frogger, for example. It's difficult to find favourite routes. I think more obscure ones. I think things like Moonshine on Kerber is a really brilliant route, an obscure one that doesn't get done much. But,
and there's a question personally for me as well. Is there's always something when you get down to this whole kind of recording history, recording grades and things like that, where you put the grades on them and you just feel uneasy about it. You know that it's going to be tricky, and you're going to potentially have some pushback from that. Can you kind of list your top 3 controversial things that you've done in this guide, just to save us having to weed through them and find out what you've committed?
I don't think I've done anything. I've really tried hard not to have any sandbags in there at all, really.
You definitely have. I don't believe that.
Perhaps I'll leave people to find those out. I tried hard not to have them sandbagged, but
I've climbed with you enough to know that cannot be true. Not at least somewhat, anyway.
I saw somebody ask what was my first route on Grit. I think it was Trafalgar Crack, I think, on Birchen Edge. And I see my son there. What would my legacy like to be? I think it's that I managed to climb good routes and routes I enjoyed. Some early ascents of very hard routes in good style, and I did that at the same time as having a family.
Yeah.
And when I had a family, I stopped climbing at weekends and I stopped going away on holidays. And I used to climb once a week, one evening a week. Occasionally I'd get out for an hour's training the weekend, and I did that for years and years and managed to climb up to E6. So I think that's the thing I'm most happy about my climbing.
Do you think you'll write any more guides?
I might do a second edition. I've started noticing a few mistakes and things I I hope to correct and maybe a few routes I should add in. So yeah, if there's a second edition, I'd probably like to improve it then.
A few more upgrades.
Yeah, yeah, maybe.
You know, it'd be popular.
Yeah. They can vote for the ones to be upgraded.
One more question that I've just seen here is, what would you say is the most underrated gritstone crag in the Peak?
Oh, wow.
Like, where do people just not really grasp?
Depends on the grade, I think. Depends on the grade. I mean, Wimbury is superb. I think a lot of people who climb on the east just don't realise how incredible Wimbury is, but you've got to climb hard to appreciate Wimbury. Standing Stones is quite impressive for the sort of middle grade and easy grade. I think a lot of the moorland stuff, the Chew Valley moorland things, are less well known because the Roaches is very well known in Staffordshire. But in the moorland, there's some superb crags, Bradenstones, Duff Stones, places like that. People don't tend to go to as much, certainly from this side, and they're really superb crags.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, wouldn't be superb. Right. Well, I think we've sort of got to the end there, and we should hand over to Gary.
Jumping at the bit.
Sorry again?
Jumping at the bit, I would think.
Yeah, probably.
I'll just jump in there and I'll just jump in there and say thank you, Graham, thank you, Tom. Great interview, Tom. Yeah, I actually I got a copy of Graham's guide a few days ago as well, and I've been leafing through it yesterday and today, and quickly penned a quick review today. I didn't really give it justice because I only got the guide yesterday. But yeah, it's great. I think the thing that I point out on there, which I stand by, is that there's always room for one more guidebook on your shelf. Even if you've got, you know, umpteen books of the Peak District, this one's you know, a great addition. So it's been really kind of, I quite enjoyed actually just kind of learning a bit more about the efforts that go into making a guide, because I think you assume these things are sitting on the shelves there and they just appear magically every few years as a new one. But yeah, there's a lot of hard work goes into them. So thank you, Graham, for that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom and Matt.
Yeah. Right, well, if we were in a pub right now, I guess we would have a quick toilet and bar break, but we're not. So if you need to go and get yourself a beer or nip off to the loo, you can do that, and we won't know. So we won't bother having a 15-minute interlude. We'll jump straight in and say thanks once more to Tom and to Graham, and welcome Gary, all being well, to the stage that is the internet. Are you there, Gary?
Yeah.
Fab. Right. Well, yeah, because there's nobody to introduce you, Gary. So I'll do a very quick intro. I suspect you don't need an introduction, but for anyone in the event that doesn't know Gary or doesn't know what he's responsible for, I think it's pretty uncontested, isn't it, really, that you've put up more routes than anyone else ever in the history of climbing in the world. You're approaching about 5,000 routes. I'm sure you can tell me exactly how many it is now.
Yeah, 4,970 at the moment. I'm not counting.
I was going to say, I learned that figure about 4 days ago. Yeah. And I was going to text you and say, Gary, do you think you could get the next 30 done before this weekend so we get a good little promo for it? But
yeah, well, yeah, it's all in the eyes of the beholder with my situation at the moment. So it's a tricky one with my circumstances. But the slide that I've started with really is basically I want to tell a story of my climbing obsession for new routes, really, and how I got into it, and a few stories that associated with it. It's very difficult to cram a climbing career into 40-45 minutes, but I'm going to try and have a go, and we'll see where it goes. I'm going to talk about a certain issue that I've never publicly talked about before, and we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to talk about how I got into climbing simplistically, and I'd like to blame my brother really, because it's all his fault. Phil started climbing with some mates at college, and he met some mates at college, and Phil was more of a walker really. He wasn't into climbing as such, and he met some mates at college who were climbers, and he started going climbing simplistically. And I was a young I suppose a teenage brat at the time. And for me, it all intrigued me that what Phil was getting up to. He was going up to places like the Roaches and even having the odd trip out to North Wales and doing some of the multi-classics and things like that, you know, the multi-pitch classics. And his real association with it was based on his reading history of British climbing, surrounded mostly around Joe Brown and Don Willans. And Phil was really quite obsessive about his need to climb in the traditional style. It was a very traditional upbringing that I had, and I'm very thankful for Phil eventually relinquishing and allowing me to go with him. And my first trip with Phil was up to the Roaches, and these are found photographs of Brown and Willans, and we started climbing at the Roaches together in I think 1973, and I think my first route at the Roaches was a route called Inverted. Phil told me that by his diaries, and we had trips everywhere in Staffordshire. This is a photograph of the Great Chimney on End Cloud, and ironically, this is me leading. You can see the Willans harness I'm climbing. There's an interesting story attached to this route because I managed to get my right leg jammed into the crack on the right, and I couldn't get it out, and it was a bit of a hectic moment for me. And the reality was I didn't know how to get my knee out, and there was two other lads climbing at the same time as us, and they abseiled down to me to rescue me, and I couldn't get my knee out the crack. So they went down to the car and got a tub of Castrol GTX and massaged it round my knee and ripped my trousers so I could get my knee out of the crack. I didn't find it very funny at the time. I think Phil, in retrospect, smiles and laughs about it all the time. But for Phil, it was really a learning experience. And Phil had this strange idea of wanting to travel to some of the mountain regions. And this is a photograph of the Tricima de Lavorado. And Phil wanted to go and climb some of these spires and wondered if I'd like to go with him, which was an odd thing, really, to travel by train. For me, a kid who'd never been out the country, all the way across France and Italy to arrive at the Tricima de Lavorado and camping by the Tricima hut, which was a very odd experience. How my parents allowed us to go, I do not know. We had 40 quid between us, that were it. We had a woolly jumper each, pair of mountain boots, and that was it. And it was a fantastic experience, actually. This is me and Phil at the top of the Cima Piccolissima. And I think this photograph was taken in 1975. Yes, it was 1975, the long hot summer, which we happened to miss because we were in the Dolomites. And it was a great experience for me, but Phil always wanted to sort of progress further from the crags in the Alps. He wanted to climb in America and lots of other places. Again, all based on his readings of Brown and Willans. And on our return, and Phil was a real advocate for studying books, guidebooks and everything. For me as a kid, I was really quite naive. And when we returned in 1976, the first edition of this magazine came out, Crags magazine, which was published by Jeff Birtles in Sheffield. And it was great for me as a kid because I saw all the superstars of the time climbing, photograph wise, in Crags magazine. And this is a very famous photograph of Supersonic that was on the front, and the statement was, could this be for Britain's first 6C, which is, it's actually now E5 6A. It might be French 6C, but it's certainly not Britain's first 6C. And I studied this magazine from page to page on a regular basis, and within it was lots of photographs, as I said, of the superstars of the time, thumbnail photographs and everything else. And all I could see was all these people getting fame and fortune. Well, I thought there was fortune. And I wanted to be a part of that to a degree. I wanted to do some new routes and get my name in Crags magazine like everybody else. I was an upstart. I was 15 years of age and no idea what it entailed, but I was still so consumed by the magazine. I felt like I had to play a part in this game. And a short while later, Phil and me were climbing at Winter's Leap, and he'd spotted an old aid line called Kaiser Wall that had not been freed. And Phil decided to go back. Phil decided with me in tandem, very much his rope boy, decided to go back and try to free it. And we did do the first free ascent, my memory of it is extremely vague. But Phil sort of captured the essence of trying to climb new routes. And we were climbing at Willersley one day, and I wanted to climb a new route. And I'd seen this bit of rock where in between two existing lines, which there was no climb up. And Phil encouraged me and supported me in doing it. And my first new route was at Willersley, and it was named Boot and Run, which ironically was named after the football team that I didn't support, because that's the style of football that I thought they played. Now, Phil wasn't really into football like I was, but he was very supportive for me doing these new routes. And as I've said, with respect to going to the Treachima, it was a really learning experience. And then I started to climb more and more at the Roaches with Phil and started to do the odd new route. This is a photograph, well, it's a photograph of License to Run at the Roaches, of one of my new routes there, which was done with a rest point, which I didn't claim, and was later done free by Pete O'Donovan. And this is a photograph, well, as it says, by Dave Jones, taken from that period. And Phil and me became very diverse. We had a bit of an argument at the time. My tempestuous self meant that we didn't really get on that well at times. And we had an argument on a route at Burbage South called Waswick, and we stopped climbing together. How the hell that was going to work, I don't know, because I had no one else to climb with. Phil had a car, and I was very much relying on him to transport me all around the Peak District or wherever we were climbing at the time. And I met up with a bunch of mates at the Roaches, and for me, it was quite a great experience, because these guys, Derek Beetlestone, John Perry, were really enthralled by the idea of going to do new routes and the fame and fortune side. Well, again, not the fortune, because I can safely say that doesn't come with it. And then we started doing a series of new routes at the Roaches together. This isn't my route, but it's an example of what was being done at the time. And I shacked up with a chap called Dave Jones, who was really helpful and would provide transport. And we started doing a number of new routes across the Staffordshire area, as were people like Jim Moran and others. And I came up with the idea that I could write an article for Crags magazine. Now, the pure idea of writing the article was get my fame and fortune. It was nothing to do with writing an article. It was all about self-interest as far as I was concerned. And I wrote an article for Crags magazine, and John Stevenson came over to Staffordshire to take some photographs, and the article went in Crags magazine. But my whole idea of this was to get my name into the magazine itself. And then I heard, ironically, that a chap called Mike McDonald had taken a photograph of me sat at the bottom of Kerber Edge. And I'd heard that Crags magazine were going to publish a thumbnail photograph of me in the magazine. But other than that, I knew nothing more. And at the time, I was working in a place called Joe Royals in Hanley. And I'd heard that this magazine was going to come out, and I heard the date that it was going to come out. So I walked all sort of excited and expectant, as a teenager would be, all the way to Hanley, about 4 miles from where I lived, knowing that this magazine was going to come into the shop. And arrived at the shop and looked on the shelves where the magazines were, and Crags magazine, the new Crags magazine, hadn't arrived. I felt really disappointed. I knew my photograph was going to be in, but I was really, really disappointed. And then the postman come through the door with a parcel. And I said to Brian, the postman's just arrived with some of the parcel. He said, "Oh, that'll be the new Crags magazine." I thought, oh, my time's come. I thought, at last. And I burst open the magazines, and there was the new Crags magazine. And I thought, well, I know my photograph's in it, but I don't know where it is. So I thumbed through all the pages, and I finally found it. And here it is, the photograph that was in Crags magazine of me. And I thought I'd actually made it. Gary Gibson, the ceaseless tide of crap new routes, or a futuristic eye for a line. And I actually thought I'd finally landed. I'd become Ron Fawcett or Pete Livesey or one of all the glitterati in Crags magazine. I thought I'd finally made it. I didn't see all the bit that was underneath. I didn't catch on to the irony or the sarcasm of the note, because it states, "I promised to be more selective in the future about my style of climbing and my routes that I chose to do as new routes." And for me, that's all that mattered. All that mattered for me was that I was actually now in Crags magazine, had achieved my goal and actually could swag around the crags because everybody would know me. Well, it doesn't work that way, does it? The irony of it was that there's always a kickback, and that kickback I later found. But during that time, having climbed with Derek Beetlestone and a number of others, I've been reading a series of guidebooks, and a guidebook by Pat Littlejohn had just come out, and I bought it, and it talked of Lundy Island and all of the endless possibilities that were available. Now, I was already hooked by the gag of new routing, and the idea of finding new routes on a place called Lundy Island, you know, it was just the ideal opportunity. And I was invited to go there with the Edinburgh Mountaineering Club. They had a spare place, and I went with a chap called Steve Keeling and Adam Cassick as our partners, and we did 1 or 2 new routes. They weren't very good at all, but what I did recognise there and then was the endless possibilities that were available. There was massive areas of rock that were untouched, whole cliffs that hadn't been climbed on, and some of them were really massively impressive. And there was one just round the corner from the Devil's Slide, which this route is on, which had never been climbed. But up that piece of rock, someone had cleaned a massive patch through the seagrass. You can see some of the seagrass in this foreground of this photograph. But they actually cleaned a massive pathway up this seagrass, and it hadn't been climbed. Well, the following year, I returned with Derek Beetlestone and I had the idea of climbing this bit of rock. Now, I've never really talked extensively about my feelings about this route, but Derek Beetlestone and myself managed to climb this piece of rock, which we nicknamed the Diamond. Now, ironically, the route had been cleaned by a chap called Pete Thexton, but he'd only managed to do the first pitch and hadn't done the rest of it. And for me, a widespread ocean of fear was a real calling card in many ways. I still think now, looking back, you know, I think it was 1981 when we did it. It was just before Princess Di and Prince Charles's wedding. And for me, I think it was probably one of the iconic moments in my climbing career. I've never really expressed my feelings about it as much as I can in various repositories. But in case of widespread ocean of fear, it was a major landmark route for me. And Derek Beetlestone, ever the competitive person that he was, had seen a line to the right, but it looked blank. It looked completely blank, and I was carrying at the time a bolt driver. I got a few bolts with me, and I'd seen other people putting bolts in. Ron Forster had been putting bolts in. He put a couple on the card, I think, and Roland Edwards had put a few bolts in. And I thought, well, why can't I put a couple of bolts in as well? I'd never put bolts in before on other crags, but I thought this was the opportunity. And the line to the right, I abseiled down, and to my surprise, there wasn't enough gear in it, so I hammered 2 bolts in it. I didn't really think about the consequences. I just felt that it was a good opportunity to, what many people would say, drag the route down to a level that I could achieve. And Derek and me climbed it. This is the first ascent photograph. You can't quite see where the bolts are, but the first bolt is just above Derek's right foot, and I put a bolt belay in because I couldn't find one. It might have been controversial, but I didn't think so. For me, it just achieved what I wanted. It achieved a new route, one of many that I was trying to do at the time, and it was important. And Derek and me had done this route, and we sat at the top of what we had now nicknamed the Diamond, and we looked northwards, and we saw this crack which pierced the crag in what is called Torrey Canyon. The crag's called Torrey Canyon, but we leafed through the guidebook, and there was no mention of this crack line. No one ever climbed this crack line. And I said to Derek, I think we should go around and climb that. And we had a chap with us called Mark Brown, and he came with us to take some photographs. And we tossed a coin at the bottom. It was absolutely roasting. We tossed a coin at the bottom, and Derek won the toss to have a go at leading it first on site completely, which was a complete anathema for what we were doing at the time. Derek climbed up, and just where you can see the runner below my right elbow, there's a triangular shaped notch in the rock. Derek grabbed the block, pulled it, and out it came. It frightened the life out of him. And I was quite happy about that because it meant that I had the chance to lead it. Unfortunately, this route's now fallen down. I think it has been reclimbed by James McAfee, but it's a significantly harder grade than it was when we did it. But for me, it was really an important moment. And also for me, it was quite interesting that the Royal Navy and Royal Marines Climbing Club approached me to write the next guidebook to Lundy Island. And I accepted, of course. Why wouldn't I? I mean, it gave me the opportunity to advertise my own routes wherever they were on the island. So I took the opportunity, and this guidebook came out, I think it was 1983. This is the first guidebook that I'd ever written to anywhere. I'd been involved in other guidebook work, but I'd seen other guidebooks that had been written, and this was quite an important stage for me. The interesting thing was now you've seen earlier Graham talking about strapodictomy, and this is the famous photograph that Bernard Newman took of Steve Bancroft on strapodictomy at Froggatt Hedge. It's very much a classic first ascent photograph, but I was so stimulated by these guidebooks, and my head was buried in them all the time, that I felt that following on from the Lundy guidebook, it was time that I wrote my own guidebook to the Peak District. And again, it was an opportunity to advertise my own routes. But the interesting thing was that I had no one to publish it. I didn't know who to approach or anything. So I wrote the book, and then Jeff Birtles, who was the editor of Crags magazine, approached me and asked me if he could publish the guidebook. But he also asked me if I'd like to be editor of his new forthcoming magazine, which was called High Magazine. Well, what an opportunity. How could I not take that opportunity? So I wrote my own guidebook, and Jeff kindly published my book, which is here. There we go. And I also became the news editor of High Magazine. And this is the first edition of High Magazine that came out back in the day, with a photograph of Chris Bonington on the front. Now, not only was this the opportunity for me to actually write about myself in the magazines, but it was also the right opportunity to actually publicise my own routes as well. This is a classic route that we did on Lundy, a route called The Colour of Life. Now, Matt Ward, who's seconding this route, we got him in the pub one night, and he said he wouldn't do this route with me because it was a traverse. So we got him in the bar, and we poured loads of beer down his throat, and he finally changed his mind, and he agreed to do it with me. But he got halfway across the traverse after I'd done it, and he wouldn't commit to the moves, as you can see where he is now, to the next series. So I just said to him, well, if you take the next bit of gear out, I said, you'll commit to it. Well, as soon as he committed to the next move, I pulled in tight, so he had to finish it. And it was an opportunity to advance my credentials even further by having a photograph on the front of High Magazine of myself and Matt. Now, there's a number of stories that were running around at the time about me. A lot of sort of inaccuracies, telling people that things I'd done weren't true. I'd lied about first ascents and some other things. Now, interestingly, there's a photograph here of a route that we did at Craigierisford called Spiral Scratch. And just around the corner, there's a really fine wall, which I'd had a look at with my wife and another chap called John Walker. And I had a good long look at it, and I fancied doing it. But the problem was I couldn't find anyone to do it with. Now, I got a mate I was climbing with at the time called Adam Hudson, and in the house where he lived was another chap called Andy Pop. And I asked Adam if he'd come out and do this route with me. And he said, yeah, I'll come and do it with you, no problem at all. So I blagged the day off work, got up about 6 o'clock in the morning, went round to pick up Adam. And Adam says, I can't make it. So, well, what am I going to do? And Andy Pop says to me, oh, I'll come with you. And ironically, Andy Pop had just hitched all the way back from North Wales, got back home about 5 o'clock in the morning, and bundled him in the car. We drove off to North Wales, walked up to Craigierisford, did my new route, and then we walked over to Deansmont and did another new route. And it was bizarre because the story then became that I'd travelled all the way to Cornwall, done a new route in Cornwall, and then travelled all the way back to North Wales to do another new route. It's amazing how stories get changed from the reality that they were. It was quite a bizarre experience. But during this time, I've got to say a bit about my wonderful wife, who's overlooking me here. I'm going to get embarrassed now. But throughout all this period, I'd met Hazel at college, and she was a very able climber. This is a photograph of Soft Touch at Baggy Point. And we got married in 1982. And the irony of it was, she's put up with so much with me that the next day we were on our way south. The day after our wedding day, we were new routing at Winter's Leap. Now, I'd read all about Ron doing new routes on his anniversary. And a famous one that he did was called Honeymoon Blues in Watercombe Jolly. So I thought, well, I'll name the new route, one of the new routes that we did in Winter's Leap. We called it We've Got the Honeymoon Blues too. It just shows you how committed I was, but how supportive Hazel was in respect to the new routing that I was doing. And this is some of the gear that we had at the time. Now, obviously, the last route I've just shown, I just tried gearing, but my brother had this idea that he could make his own hexagonal nuts rather than buy them from the local shop. They were quite expensive. And this is one that he made. It's, I think it's the equivalent of a hex 8, but he made it with full metal. And believe you me, it was about 3 kilos. And this just shows the size of it. And some of the other equipment that I used at the time wears out. This is a full descender, worn through, it wore out, wore through at the top of a route I was abseiling in Cheadale, which I think is now called the Fifth Element. And it just broke. Luckily, I had the backup of a shunt above it, which meant that even though it wore all the way through, there was no effect on me falling down the rope and hitting the ground as such. So I'm going to tell a little story about the new route names that I had linked to this band, my favourite band. And I had this idea that if I did a new route on a new crag, I'd name it after a Stranglers track. And those Stranglers tracks are just scattered all across the crags in Britain as I did them. And I never thought anything more of it. And I did a new route at the Roaches in 1979 called Bed of Nails. And the irony of it is that whilst I used to name my routes after Stranglers tracks, the Stranglers released a song in 1995 called Bed of Nails. So they were naming their routes now, their songs now after my routes, which I thought was quite an ironic thing. And I felt very flattered by that. Obviously, they knew nothing about it, but that's by the by. And the obsession for me with the Stranglers means that I've actually been to see them 180 times live, which is perhaps a sad indictment of my musical tastes. But in 1988, some friends of mine, Gordon Jenkin and Matt Ward, had developed a crag in the Wye Valley on the opposite side to Winter's Leap. But they wouldn't tell me about it because the simple reason was that if they told me about it, they knew full well that I'd go down and do more routes than they could do. And then I discovered the crag with them. They took me there one day and discovered that there was a whole section of crag without any routes on it, the main crag. And I seconded a mate called John Holcroft and Hazel and basically bullied them into coming with me to Bannygore. And at the right-hand side of the main crag, there was an easy VS route called Top Cat. And I thought, well, I can get up Top Cat and I can actually traverse across the ledge, put some gear in to abseil off and abseil down to start cleaning some of the routes. Now, I'd already had a number of experiences with falling rock. I had a bad experience with some falling rock on Lundy when a microwave-sized block came hurtling past me on a route I was cleaning on Blackwall, which ended up being called Emergency Ward 10. But while I was abseiling at Bannygore, sadly, I got hit by a large piece of rock on the forehead. I wasn't wearing a helmet at the time, but I think the velocity of the rock probably would have meant that it would have smashed any helmet that I had on to bits. It also then cut my rope, and I fell through the air about 70 or 80 feet through the trees, and I was lucky to land in what was probably the only clearing. and my wife, Hazel, was just on the ledge to the side, and John was on the ledge to the side. And I think out of the corner of their eyes, they saw me fall through the air, and I hit the ground, and didn't have, it was very serious consequences. It was quite a worrying moment, and it's no real badge of honor. It's that long since it happened. It seems almost part of my life, but I had a fractured skull, 2 fractured orbits. I had a piece of tree stuck out of my lip. And we were really lucky that the only clearing in the forest canopy meant that the helicopter that was called John rushed to the top and charged into somebody's garden, got to a telephone and rang out the mountain rescue, and the RAF helicopter came. Luckily, the only clearing in the forest I'd fallen through, and they were able to actually winch me into the helicopter. I ended up in French A Hospital on a life support machine for, I think it was 6 days, as well as in an induced coma. It's not a badge of honor really to have experienced that. And these are some of the headlines that followed on in local papers. And when I left the hospital, the consultant said to me, if you go climbing again, I don't want you, if you're falling off, you could seriously damage your head again. And that could be, that could be a death sentence to you. So what I suggest is that you don't do anything serious like that. What you do is climb something that's more at easy angled. So I got this idea, well, if I go climbing on slate, on the bold routes, that, I'm not going to swing in and hit everything. What I didn't realise, well, there's no gear on most of them, so I was just going to hit the ground and damage myself in a different way, which is rather a stupid thought, really. Now, throughout all of the times that I've been climbing, there's a number of funny things that have happened to me. The great John Allen left me this note. I don't know whether you can actually read that. It's just sideways round, but it states, "Dear Gary, to whom it may concern." I've got to read the side on, so I'm sorry. "Can you wait until I've bolted these routes? It's taken me hours, days to clean them, John Allen." I also have been confronted over the times by a number of quarry companies about advertising routes. I was challenged by Tarmac themselves, who wrote a letter to me about Halldale Quarry in Matlock, as well as Intake Quarry, about me advertising their routes on their land on my website. But one of the things that I've been, perhaps most associated with, as Matt talked about earlier, was hundreds and hundreds of new routes. And one of the big problems that I have, it's been a bit of a noose around my neck. And for me, the 4,000th was a major milestone. I'm just going to show you some photographs of some of the other routes that I've done. Matt's just asked me, have I saved a Strangler song name for a very special route? Well, I think in the circumstances, I might and I might not. I'm hoping if I name a route Mission 5000, that the Stranglers will name a song after that route name, rather than me name a route after one of their songs. But I'm going to think about that, so we shall see. And obviously I've been challenged by the tag of climbing numerous new routes, and a lot of the things that I have done, I've been very poor over the years. There's no question about that. But the issue for me has always been about numbers rather than quality. I feel that, in all honesty, I hope I've done some fantastic routes. I've actually got a photograph of me. I've actually got this cap upstairs, but I don't think it'd be right for me to wear it because it hardly fits now. So my head's such a distorted way. And you can see I actually was a fashionista at the time, wearing all of this garb that Troll used to send to me. He used to send to me a new pair of tights every week, multicolours, and expect that I'd wear them. Well, of course I would. Why wouldn't I? And this particular photograph shows probably the most garish style I've ever had. And there's an interesting story that I did some work for the BMC on an injuries symposium in Sheffield. And we just done a lecture, a chap called Rob and me had just done a lecture on foot injuries in rock climbing. And we were stood finished at the end. A young lady came up to me at the end and said, "Are you Gary Gibson?" I said, "Yes, yes. I've got some photographs of you on my wall at home. I've got some photographs of you wearing tights." And I was thinking, oh, my luck's in here. And then she says, "Yes, you're my spandex hero." And then I was lucky to be invited to number 10 in, I think it was 2010. And I thought I was going to be offered an OBE, the owner of the Bolton Empire, but I never did get that after all. I'm going to tell you an interesting story because a lot of the plan for me was to seek fame and fortune. Well, obviously never going to gain any fame, any fortune from it. But there's an interesting story about Jerry Moffat. Jerry Moffat was on a tour of North America, and he was out climbing, sampling various areas. He went out climbing to the Shawangunks. And I think he was with Chris Hamper. I'm not 100% certain, but they were climbing at the Shawangunks and they were trying a certain route. And there was a really hard rock over on it, but neither of them would commit to it. So they had a go at it, but he wouldn't commit to it. So there was two climbers there, a chap called Harrison Decker and John Sherman. John Sherman is very famous for developing the V grade. And Jerry and Chris couldn't do this route at all. And they left all the gear in. And John Sherman says, do you want me to have a go? So they went across and he says, yeah, go on, we'll have a go. I'll have a go. So he went across, traversed across, and he couldn't do the move either. Anyway, when he started reversing back, he grabbed hold of a large flake and pulled it off, got the rope on, ripped the peg out on the rope, went flying through the trees, hit the ground, and Jerry and Chris went down to him to see if he was all right. And all John Sherman was asking was, well, I want to go for a pee. Anyway, he looked up at Jerry and he says to him, I know you, don't I? I've seen your face in the magazines. And Jerry puffed out his chest and he says, yes, I think you might have done. And Jerry felt all proud. And John Sherman says to Jerry Moffat, he says, yeah, I've seen your photograph in the magazine. He says, you're Gary Gibson. And I think Jerry Moffat was probably never been more deflated in his life than that comment. One other thing that I haven't mentioned is I last year on the 7th of April, I had a stroke, sadly supported by my wife and lots of friends. I just say on finishing, I just like to say how thankful I am for all the support I've had from the climbing world over the effects of the stroke that I've had on me. But one final comment. When I saw Jerry Moffat's book and Ron Fawcett's book and Andy Pollitt's book, I always had the desire to write my own book. And this is an ironic comment. I thought Against Gravity by Gary Gibson might be the most appropriate name, especially considering my size at the time, might be the most appropriate name for the book. But I came up instead with a name for the book of Blood, Sweat and Smears, which seemed appropriate considering all the things that have happened to me over my climbing career, and the smears obviously related to some of the criticism that I've had. So there you go. I think I'll leave it on that. Thank you very much.
I'm going to jump.
Are there any questions?
I'm going to jump back in here and say thank you, Gary, very much. Yeah, there was I passed the one question on. That was actually from Graham. Have you got a special name for your 5,000th route? Any idea when that 5,000th route is going to come?
I'm hoping, Matt, that it is in the middle of this year, because of all the traumas that I've had with the stroke, and I've had an trapped nerve in my right eye, and the concerns. I thought I might call it Mission 5,000 because it will be a major feat for me to be able to do that 5,000th route, considering all the complications that I've currently got medically. So I think I might call it Mission 5,000, but I don't know yet. And I know where it's going to be.
Have you considered doing it in Goddard's Quarry, where they're currently filming Mission Impossible?
Well, I walked in the other day, but they mistook me for Mel Gibson. Yeah, well, I'll try that one. I'll make sure I aren't under the train, Matt.
Oh yeah, it's amazing what they're doing over there.
Yeah, they just they are just taking a train off the cliff, aren't they?
They've built, yeah, if anyone has not seen it, they've built a gantry out of the edge of the quarry. Is it Goddard's or is it the one next to it? It's Goddard's.
It says Goddard, what we call Goddard's too. So it's between Goddard's and Hidden Quarry.
Yeah, and they built a gantry about 40, 50 feet out from the edge of the quarry, maybe even more.
Oh, right.
Probably maybe 80 feet out. And
right.
basically, I presume Tom Cruise is going to be driving a train or something. I don't know. He likes to do his own stunts, and they're going to drive the train off the end of the gantry into the quarry.
Oh, right. Okay. I didn't see it, but you park by Stony West and walk up from there. There's a public footpath that goes past it, a bridleway footpath, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah.
So, we'll go and have a look next time we're in the Peak.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody involved in this evening. It's been it's just cracking. So when I started doing these lectures down at the Lescar in 2004, 2005, and I remember John Beattie coming along and saying that it was really good. It kind of felt like proper grassroots lectures, kind of climbers talking about climbing. And this is, as the online talks we've done, this one is definitely the closest we've come to the grassroots climbers talking about climbing lectures at the Lescar. So I hope people have enjoyed listening to Graham and Tom and to Gary. And yeah, Gary didn't give much of a plug for his book there, but I read that and reviewed that at the time. I think it's a really entertaining read. You know, if you climb, you've almost certainly done some of Gary's routes. So I think you owe it to him to go and buy his book and have a read of it. I've got
Matt. I've still got some available.
Have you? Great.
There's not overly many left, but there's enough.
I'll post an email out shortly this evening with details of Gary's website and of Tom's website, Lattice Climbing, and of Graham's guidebook and where to get that. Okay. And we'll put the talk on YouTube tomorrow. So if you know anyone, or if you had any internet trouble today, or you know anyone who'd like to watch it and didn't watch it, then you know, get them to tune in tomorrow.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Really enjoyable.
Cheers, mate.
I'm just going to make a little turn a little setting on in here, so if anybody does want to unmute themselves and say anything or ask a question out loud or just say goodbye or thank you, you're welcome to. But I'll close the meeting in a minute or two, depending on what people have got to say. Anyway, thanks guys. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. Thank you.
Okay, go for a climb sometime, Graham.
It'd be good fun. We're not far apart.
No, it's like a little close on its own.
I do have a place I think your lads would really enjoy going if they want to try some new stuff that's highball bouldering and it's not been done.
Well, my youngest particularly is very much into new routing, and wherever, in fact, we was looking through your guidebook whilst he was eating breakfast this morning, and he opened it on the page with unfamiliar at Stanage, and he said, oh, he ignored unfamiliar, and he pointed at a little crack in the back, and he goes, that's my new route, a squash and a squeeze. And last time we were up at the plantation, he and his friend had gone questing into the subterranean caves in the boulders behind unfamiliar, and he'd managed to do a bunch of moves in there and pull together a little route and called it a squash and a squeeze. So he's only 12.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So yeah,
that might have been my 5,000th new route.
Gary, you're not fit in there, mate.
I think the squash and the squeeze is you trying to get into your Leica again, Gary, isn't it?
Oh, anytime, mate. I'll come round and I'll model it for you.
Lovely.
Right, I'm going to close the meeting down. Thanks
Thanks,
guys.
Matt.
Please,
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Gary.
if you haven't already made a donation, it would be fab if you could do. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.